Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. We're going to be looking at a Unit 1 Comparative Government FRQ. This is going to be a quantitative analysis FRQ. So this is similar to what you'll see on question 2 for the AP exam on your FRQ portion. And so you're going to be given a 5-part FRQ related to either a graph, a map, or a chart that's going to provide some kind of numerical, some kind of quantitative information that you're going to have to analyze and answer questions about, as well as answer questions of the related concepts. So our graph here is showing the Gini coefficient for Mexico from 1996 to 2016. And we know that with the Gini coefficient, the higher the coefficient value is, the more income inequality there is. The lower the Gini coefficient value is, the lower the income inequality value is. And we learned this measurement alongside many others like GDP and HDI and the transparency index on the very first lesson of Unit 1. So we're going to be applying that to Mexico and other concepts that we've learned so far in the course. So let's move into part 1. So you're going to have about 2 questions on this FRQ directly related to the charts. You don't have to have any outside information to actually answer these questions here. So let's look at the chart. We're looking at the Gini coefficient. We see that it's kind of fluctuated over time, but overall it has decreased. So the question's asking, using the data on the graph, that means you use the data on the graph, identify the year or years closest to the second highest rates of income inequality. All right, so it doesn't say the highest Gini coefficient, it says highest rates of income inequality. And we know that the higher the Gini coefficient, the higher the income inequality is. So that's something you're going to have to know, because there are going to be students out there that think a higher Gini coefficient means higher equality, but that's not the case. Higher Gini coefficient means higher inequality related to income. So let's point out the highest rate of the Gini coefficient is 51.4 in the year 2000. So that means the second highest rate is going to be kind of along this line here. I mean, the second highest rate would obviously be like the closest to this point here, but we're looking for a year closest to that. So that's going to be these 2 years located right here. And that's going to be about right here and right here. So that's 2000, that's 2002, that's probably 2001, that's 1998, that's 2000, that's going to be 1999. Some students would have only put either 1999 or 2001. That's not the case, because they have relatively similar levels of income inequality, because the slopes of this line, this positive slope, is the positive version of this slope here. So it's like saying y is equal to x. This one would be y is equal to negative x. So if you're a math person, that's an easy way to kind of look at this. So that's why the answer is 1999 to 2001. All right, part B, using the data on the graph, which means use the data on the graph. Describe a change in the data for Mexico between 1996 and 2016. So probably the most common answer that would have been given for this prompt is that from 1996 to 2016, Mexico's Gini coefficient has overall declined. It's gone from 48.2 to 43.4. Great. Those values aren't needed, but you could have given them. You could have given the range as well. I don't think you would have calculated the slope. That's probably a little too much for you, and I don't suggest doing a lot of math on the AP exam, or really any math for that matter. You could have also just given a general trend, a more specific trend. So, for example, from 1996 to 2000, the Gini coefficient increase. We saw that trend as well from 2004 to 2005, as well as 2008 to 2014. We could also say from 2000 to 2004, Mexico's Gini coefficient decreased. We also saw that trend in 2005 to 2008 or 2014 to 2016. Something that you probably would have not gotten credit for is just saying that the Gini coefficient has fluctuated. To get credit for that, you would have to say that A, it fluctuates, B, you have to give a certain period that it's increased, and C, a certain period that it's decreased to show that it has fluctuated during this 20-year time period. Part C, describe one way that democratic elections may impact income inequality rates. So we're just looking at really how elections in Mexico. We see that Mexico is a democratizing country, so we see more free, fair, and competitive elections. How could that have impacted income inequality rates? So, for example, a shift in policy after democratic elections For example, a government may implement progressive taxation. They can put in social welfare programs. They can put in labor market reforms that can be aimed at reducing income inequality. All of these measures are usually put in with the intention to reduce income inequality. Do we see that happen in every case? No, but these are usually put in for the intention, and sometimes that does happen. And so sometimes we may see that income inequality rates do drop as a result. And we typically see that social welfare programs develop, and they develop more successfully in democratic countries with democratic elections. Another response would have been that a newly elected governments may focus on redistributing wealth through policies like social safety nets or welfare programs, minimum wage increases, educational opportunities. That's a big one as well, and that can reduce income inequality as well. Democratic elections may bring political pressure for policies that promote economic equality, such as reducing corruption or improving access to healthcare and education for disadvantaged groups as well. So all of these are ways that you can reduce inequality rates. And so there are really two things that you had to put. You have to give an example of how inequality rates can be impacted, not necessarily increase or decrease. Most of these responses are all talking about trying to reduce some, but you could talk about ways that it tries to increase some as well, or just ways that it does increase them. I don't think they will intentionally increase them, but they can. Yeah, but you also have to talk about how this relates to elections. So you would say that Democratic elections would result in shift in policy, or there'd be a newly elected government with new officials, with new ideologies or policies, or from a new political party that addresses inequality rates as well. So that is important, since it does ask about elections. You have to kind of connect your response to elections or elected bodies or people or parties. Moving on to part D, using the data on the graph, draw a conclusion about democratization and income inequality rates in Mexico from 1996 to 2016. So these seem like straightforward questions, and oftentimes they are, but sometimes these can be very, very tricky. And so if we remember on the graph, yes, the overall income inequality from 1996 to 2016 has decreased in Mexico. But notice that it's fluctuated. There are periods of increase and periods of significant decrease. And that shows a lot of internal changes within the government and the economic structure of the country of Mexico. So that's something you need to keep in mind when answering this question. So a very simple response, probably the best response for this prompt, would have been that democratization in Mexico has not resulted in consistent reduction in income inequality. That's it. That's your conclusion. If you wanted to elaborate further, you could talk about how it's fluctuated. So, for example, in this one, although some democratic periods show small decreases or just decreases in general, you don't really have to say small. That's not necessary. We see decreases in income inequality. Other periods show increases, suggesting that democratization alone is not sufficient to address inequality. That's another really great response for this prompt. Another one, democratic policies aimed at reducing inequality have mixed results, as we've seen some instances of inequality decreasing, some increasing. We can see that there's a lot of economic factors, global factors that can influence income distribution that's more influential than the political system. After the transition to democracy, income inequality might have remained high or even increased due to policy shifts, economic instability, or structural challenges that democratic governments could not immediately resolve. Doesn't mean they won't resolve them in the future, but there are probably problems in government inconsistencies and instabilities that are left alone from the authoritarian government that the democratic government has to fix or has to work with. External factors like trade agreements that involve international economic exchanges. There's also internal factors like economic reforms and government spending and government policy and inflation that play significant roles in shaping income inequality during Mexico's democratization process. So democratization alone has not influenced income inequality. And that's something that we have definitely taken away from this part. Part E, explain one way that Mexico's authoritarian history is reflected in its income inequality rate. So what are some historical reasons that Mexico has income inequality due to being an authoritarian regime? So they had authoritarian rule under the Industrial Revolutionary Party, and that was accompanied by the government controlling key industries and resources like oil, and that concentrated wealth in a small group of people, a small elite, and it may have limited economic opportunities for the majority of the people, the working class, or at least economic opportunities that resulted in a wide variety of different incomes for the people within the country, and that contributed to income inequality. We call these public sector services or goods or public sector industries. Authoritarian government restricted political opposition and labor rights. We see that in a lot of authoritarian regimes, not just Mexico, and that prevents workers from organizing for higher wages or protesting for higher wages or better working condition. We don't see as many labor unions form, or at least effective labor unions. We see a lot more government opposition to labor unions, other forms of civil society, and that can lead to stagnant incomes for large sectors of the population. Authoritarian regimes often did not prioritize social welfare programs, or they didn't produce social welfare programs, and we see that more in democratic regimes, and that leaves for large portions of the population without support systems that could reduce poverty and inequality. During periods of authoritarian rule, land reforms were often skewed in favor of wealthy landowners. I don't think really any of you would have responded like this. It's just something to carry on, and you may answer this on the AP exam. But any type of land reforms were usually skewed in favor of wealthy landowners. These are the people that had the most money, so they can afford the land. That makes sense. You have to pay for land. Land's expensive. And that can leave rural populations with limited land access or resources, and that can contribute to wealth disparities. So what are some takeaways? What are the key terms we discussed? We discussed income inequality. I don't know why that's in the middle, but we discussed income inequality. That's the uneven distribution of wealth and economic opportunity across the population. We looked at the PRI briefly in that last part. So if you didn't know what the PRI is, that's the Industrial Revolutionary Party. That's Mexico's dominant political party for most of the 1900s when they were under authoritarian rule. They maintained power through these authoritarian practices, state-led economic policies, and public sectors. We also saw a corporatist political system that controlled labor, agriculture, and business sectors. We looked at land reforms, which are policies aimed at redistributing land to the people, though in Mexico, implementation as a result of authoritarian history favored political elites over rural populations. What are some commonly confused concepts? Authoritarian legacy and inequality. We've seen that in Mexico. They have a long history of centralized control under the PRI. That's led to wealth concentration and a lot of times limited opportunities for the majority. We see that the government had dominance over key industries that kept wealth in the hands of a small elite, and that contributed to persistent income inequality. We see democratic regimes have control over certain industries, like in the UK, they've had control over public transportation, for example. And sometimes that does work, and sometimes it doesn't work, even in democratic regimes. But in authoritarian regimes particularly, we see a lot more corruption, we see a lot more instability, we see a lot more fraudulent behavior, we see and a lot less funding going to the people, a lot worse working conditions, a lot less wages going to the people. So even though we have a lot of government control over industries in democratic regimes, they're a lot more corrupt and a lot more poorly run in authoritarian regimes. We also see a lack of social welfare programs, a lot less investment, a lot less promotion. We see a lot less support systems that can reduce poverty and reduce opportunities and increase income inequality. And we're not just talking about healthcare. We're not just talking about social security, food stamps, stuff we see here in the United States when we think of social welfare. I'm talking about infrastructure. I'm talking about water systems. I'm talking about education, particularly. We see in authoritarian regimes that these are not a big priority for the government to fund or to promote. Another key concept that's commonly confused and not really touched upon is skewed land reforms. We see that in authoritarian regimes, policies that relate to land reforms will favor wealthy landowners, limiting land access and resources for rural populations, and that can lead to disparities. We can also touch on economic liberalization. Mexico has shifted towards more neoliberal policies like privatization and deregulation. So, for example, Pemex, which is a major oil industry in Mexico, has gone from government control, it's gone from the public sector to the private sector, and that's usually aimed at economic growth, and it can lead to inequalities. It can also lead to equality depending on how it goes. Now, there's a difference between neoliberalism and socialism. Economic liberalization, neoliberalism emphasizes free markets and reduced government control, such as the privatization and deregulation of industries. However, land reforms and other wealth redistribution and equity policies are more socialist, and we've learned that in Unit 3 of the course. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0, and it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.